Welcome everyone to 30 Minutes to Success, How to Plan and Budget for 2013 with Cloud in Mind. Thank you for joining us today for this Bluelock webinar. The webinar will last no more than 30 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. Please stay tuned to the end when we'll announce one lucky winner to receive an iPad mini. We'll choose the winners from the remaining attendees at the end of the webinar. My name is Diana Nolting, and I'm your moderator for this session. Your speaker today is Bluelock CTO Pat O'Day. Pat's going to discuss strategies, tips, and tricks to budget for cloud in 2013. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the chat window, and we'll be sure to answer those at the end. And now I'm going to hand it off to Pat to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Diana. Hello, everybody. I'm actually broadcasting live from Las Vegas here. I'm attending the Gartner AADI conference, and I also had time to visit the Amazon conference. And to put it mildly, the hype around cloud has rapidly transformed into reality because everyone here, probably 8,000 people between the two events, if not more, are all trying to figure out how to get this done in 2013, not trying to figure out whether or not they're going to do it. So that sort of reemphasized the point of trying to help people figure out how to move forward, or at least help you round out some of the ideas if you're already doing some planning going into next year. So budgeting is, for all those who have done it, particularly in an IT context, planning, capacity planning, all of those kinds of things, the level of detail you've got to get into is really complex. So getting any of that done in 30 minutes would be a major accomplishment. So this is going to be a fairly high-level approach. I would just offer that if anyone wants to go deeper on some of the topics or some of the numbers that we show and tease out some specific nuances around a particular area of cost, we've certainly seen those numbers, very familiar with those things. Maybe even what some of the gotchas might be, a little more color around those, please reach out to us after the session. And if there's interest in even doing another 30-minute session that sort of takes a deep dive into any of those aspects, that feedback would be really helpful for us because that's something we're considering doing. So at the end, we're hoping that you're going to be able to create a solid plan to sort of move your cloud mission forward. And what you'll see is we've broken the concept of mission into sort of a small, medium, and large, but also the idea of public cloud versus building your own private cloud versus even using software as a service to some degree, how to sort of figure out which category you fit into, and then how to take steps forward based on sort of that general categorization to try and, you know, flavor your budget with some actual detail to move forward, or at least know what some of the higher level topics are that might be worth, you know, clicking down into, doing some additional research on to make you successful next year. And then we tried to throw some numbers out there. You know, like I said, we've been doing this for a while, so we took some of the costs out of our own environment, some of the costs from some of the companies we worked with that have actually gone and built their own environments, and some of the sort of areas of cost within each one of those larger buckets for the things to consider. And then we also tried to list at the end some gotchas and some other things to consider, because if this is new to you, there are a lot of potential pitfalls that might catch you, and that's never good when you're trying to explain to the CFO why you missed you know, a fairly large expense, or when you're trying to explain to the business that it took you, you know, 3 months or however longer to get something done than you originally planned. So we're going to try and help you avoid as much of that as possible. So what happened in 2012? Sort of get this going even further, like I said, you know, the interest out here in Vegas right now is pretty tremendous, but let's try and turn it into numbers a little bit. So cloud adoption increased to 48%. So across public cloud, private cloud, software as a service, you know, based on this data, it looks like almost 50% of companies are using it in some way, shape, or form, and that's a lot. That's, you know, I don't know what the trajectory looks like specifically, but it's easy to envision that by the first quarter, second quarter of next year, that more than half of companies will be using cloud in some form. 83% of IT decision makers believe that it's been effective. So the short story is those implementations occurred, and they went well, they solved a problem or maybe specific problems the company had in a way that they hadn't been able to solve that in the past, and so they're going to go further, so their adoption is actually going to increase. And we've seen that. We've seen companies come into our environment just more in a tire-kicking proof of concept mode and then really make big investments into it later because they sort of get a rhythm and understand how it works. And a 27% rise in first-time users. So you look at this, the number of people that are maybe were reading Gartner research reports, reading internet articles and not really ready to do anything. You know, this is a big spike up in the number of people that have actually taken a step forward and have given it a try in some fashion. So in terms of picking your approach, this is where, you know, again, this may be too sort of distilled, but we thought it would be easy, not knowing who would be attending the call, and I imagine a lot of you, you know, are either from small companies or potentially even from, you know, larger Fortune 500. Some of you might be business users, some of you might be in IT. So we wanted a sort of a general purpose thing that you could start with to sort of land somewhere, and then we're going to tell some stories about some companies and hope that you identify with and sort of where we plotted out where they landed here. So how do you get started? This is probably the real key. There are three ways we're seeing people approach this, and they have a huge impact on what the spending would be. So the first concept is this walk before you run. So if you're familiar with virtualization and you're using it in your environment, you may have already virtualized 25%. Some people have virtualized even 50 or 75% of their environment. The idea that you're going to take that next step and convert your virtual environment into a private cloud by adding self-service, by adding APIs, maybe object storage, a couple more capabilities, but you're sort of just following this progressive journey moving forward. But, you know, very sort of a very thoughtful approach to it, very iterative, you know, 5% of the time versus whole change. The other thing we're seeing is that people who aren't ready to do that, or maybe, you know, in 2013, they may end up with the funds to convert their environment into a private cloud, but the business units want to start acting with agility, maybe even right now, but certainly, you know, when their funding gets approved in January, if you're on a fiscal calendar, they're going to want to actually start working on cloud or acting in a cloud-like way immediately. So in these situations, it's not so much about what you're doing with your infrastructure from an IT standpoint, it's about specific projects that these business units might have and how do you enable them. So we certainly have seen a lot of this where a company will pick, you know, maybe a marketing initiative, maybe a new application, and instead of spinning it up somewhere in the data center somewhere, they'll actually use that as a way to learn about cloud and deploy that. And then, you know, some companies are quite literally rethinking everything. They're trying to transform everything they're doing to more of a cloud-first mentality. And these are folks that have typically experienced cloud, maybe have been using it for 2 or 3 years, and have realized that the benefits are there, they're very real, and that the benefit is much greater the faster they can sort of convert to this new normal. But that's also, you know, if you don't understand what the benefits are and what the risks are and all that very well, this could be, you know, potentially really detrimental if you took a little bit too much risk. So the other piece here, we talked a little bit about this before, is who is being served by this this change most effectively in terms of budgeting. So if you're an infrastructure owner in the IT organization, you know, you're used to buying hardware, software, you know, maybe even power and cooling depending on what your role is there. And you're really traditionally measured based on efficiency, and you're really trying to be all things to all people, a lot of conflicting priorities. So your world typically, from what we've seen, revolves around what we call general purpose infrastructure. So you want sort of a general purpose cloud environment that can serve any number of business unit needs or application and data needs. So different levels of security, different levels of performance, et cetera, but all kind of coming from one environment. Application owners aren't always in the business unit. They're sometimes in IT, but their real focus is around one specific or maybe a handful of specific applications. And they're really looking at all these agility benefits, paying for what you use, being able to get resources, you know, the minute you click the mouse, And their challenge is they're not always a priority to IT. I think they're certainly a priority, but they're not always necessarily the #1 priority relative to how quickly they need to get something done. It's kind of like looking at, a Starbucks line as you're driving by in your car and walking down the sidewalk, and you've got, 2 different coffee shops, and one's got, 20 people waiting in line, and one has nobody, or, you go to the little kiosk and just put your coins in the machine and get coffee out that way. But the ability for a business unit to make that decision as to whether they want, this sort of mission-critical good stuff, and they'll wait in line to get that with everybody else, or they just need to get something done immediately, and they're willing to take a little bit of risk, so they get that done. So let's get into the dollars and details a little bit now. We sort of understand a little bit of the context. So this may be a little backwards, but we're going to give you the numbers first, and then we're going to back into how we got there. So if anyone has any questions or wants to go back to that at the end, let us know. So that this matrix sort of shows the small, medium, large at high-level buckets of spending, and we will click down and show you what the details are in each one of those buckets. But and then the left to right is sort of public cloud, private cloud, and software as a service. So once we get into the slides and you sort of pull all this together and you can see where you're going to land in terms of your spending, you can sort of identify which buckets here. In hindsight, we probably should have put this at the end, but that's my fault. So for a small, we'll start in the upper left corner, so a small public cloud environment, you're looking at around $3,000 a month. This will probably handle a handful of applications or one smaller internet-facing application, all the way to, some people are spending $10,000 to $100,000 a month, but you're looking at that in contrast to what might have been a $5 or $6 million capital spend. So it does sound like a lot of money, but when you're looking at what it would have cost to build the private cloud part of it, it sort of all works itself out. Everybody's buying the same components at the end of the day: RAM, CPU, storage, and network bandwidth. So there's not a lot of mystery in that. Private cloud, probably the key nuance here is how much capacity you need, and we'll show that on one of the next slides, is how much capacity kind of comes out of each one of these numbers. But you can invest anywhere from something as simple as $10,000 or $20,000, buy a pair of servers with a little bit of shared storage, install VMware on there, and install some cloud capability like vCloud Director, and you've essentially got 100 VMs or so, or 20 or 30 VMs or so worth of self-service you can offer to a business. So for a smaller organization or maybe a remote office, that might be pretty effective in sort of giving them some independence, but keeping the IT organization in the role of governance. But all the way on the right side, the $500,000 number is probably not even realistic. It's probably $2 or $3 million. I know that just the storage environment that we buy when we light up the new cluster is more than $500,000, and that's without any compute, without any network, no cabinets, no power and cooling. The other key is if you look at the contrast here between the private cloud line and the public cloud line, you'll notice that there's 2 categories of spend on private cloud, and there's only one on public cloud. And that's this operational dollar. So the monthly recurring cost for the labor, power, any kind of software licensing that you would have, all that stuff that repeats, you're paying those costs independently in a private cloud scenario, but they're actually folded together in the public cloud. So one mistake we see is when people go to budget for spending is that they will, on the private cloud side, they will only budget for the hardware, and they'll miss some of the operational costs. Or if they're trying to figure out whether they should invest more in public cloud versus private cloud, they will only compare the cost of the hardware. They won't actually include the cost, to operate all of it, which is essentially free in the public cloud side. Or if you just look at it as a hardware cost, it's sort of invisible in there. But just know that we have no magic wands here. There are real people doing real work, just like there are in your world, to keep those assets running. And that same concept applies if you go down to the bottom line with software as a service, where you've got more of a per user cost in most cases, and that also includes not only the hardware cost, but it also includes the people, process technology, or the people in the process side of it, patching software, the security. You know, you think about how do these software as a service companies protect themselves when they come under massive denial of service attacks? Well, they spend money on, you know, really good technology to stop that, and that gets folded into that per user cost. So it's important to tease those things out, especially if you're talking about, you know, sort of doing this at scale and really trying to do any kind of decision about where you put a workload based specifically on cost. So what will these spends get you? So I'll jump through a couple examples here. Let's go down the private cloud line right there in the middle. So as I mentioned, if you look at it from a VM count, the easiest way to get here is to take how many virtual machines you think you might have, or that because you're going to be enabling self-service as part of this process, how many VMs you think people might spin up, and figure a factor of how many gigs of RAM, how many virtual CPUs, how much storage the average VM probably already in your environment uses today, and then multiply that all together, and you'll get a rough feel for how much storage, how many CPUs, et cetera, you need. You can then go approach your typical hardware vendor, whoever you currently use, CDW, Dell, and they're pretty good at putting a packaged offering together for you on the small side. On the large side, you know, when you get into 800 terabytes, thousands and thousands of VMs, services, and you got backup and all these other things that need to integrate in there. There's a lot more complexity involved in that, and you know, you start to ask little questions like, so are we going to back the entire private cloud up, or are we actually going to allow the users to come in and pick what gets backed up on their own? So, and that will change how much backup capacity you need. The biggest thing in private cloud that we see people run into is this concept of sprawl. So if you're sort of sizing this based on what you think will happen, I would encourage you to maybe at least go to 150% of that, if not 200% of that, because once you open the floodgates around self-service, and there really aren't any controls in terms of cost, in that a developer can come in and spin up 5 machines, 10 machines, 15 machines, and they don't see the impact of what that costs the business, they're going to do that to try and get their job done, which is certainly a healthy capability to add, but if you don't have any way to manage or sort of constrain that from a cost standpoint, just know that sprawl is going to occur. If you look at the public cloud line, you know, small, you know, we see people going in with test and dev workloads, kind of kicking the tires. That's sort of what those numbers that we threw out were. I mean, you can get cloud resources now for, you know, a couple dollars a month, up to a couple $100 a month. But you know, it's kind of little tiny environments. There are people. I saw a great presentation from NASA yesterday. You know, running large mission critical workloads, big, high availability, guaranteed performance, high security requirements in the public cloud. But their challenges from a cost standpoint is they put in a lot of investment into the cloud resources themselves, but they also had to put a lot of, again, people in process and even additional technology on top of their cloud spend to achieve all these capabilities, because in a lot of cases, you know, the cloud itself doesn't give you as much security or as mission critical capability that you need, or it sort of gives you all the tools, but you've got to add additional technology to put all that stuff together. So when we were talking about the costs on the prior page, those are the things we had in mind. And if we just go quickly to the SaaS line, you know, if you just need a few users, kind of a Dropbox sort of scenario, they just need to collaborate, it's really not that big of a deal. But as you start going into larger investments, and we'll talk about one of those, the amount of integration cost that you're going to pay. So it may be, you know, $25 a user to get access to the SaaS application for CRM or something, but to make that CRM environment behave the way your business behaves may require, you know, a several $100,000, if not a $1 million investment from professional services, because they've got to do all the integration of your business process. So some budgeting in action here. So these are 3 stories. This is a SaaS story. Actually, this company, a large pharmaceutical company that we work with, They're doing investments in SaaS, in public cloud, and private cloud. They really wanted to build a large private cloud environment. I think they actually launched that this year because they want to transform how all the VMs in their internal environment are being used and just really sort of modernize their existing infrastructure. But then they also wanted to modernize some of their applications, and when they looked at their existing CRM solution that was supporting about 7,000 salespeople, they realized that the easiest way to do that would probably go to a SaaS offering. So instead of trying to transform, modernize the infrastructure, and then modernize the application inside of their data center, they actually moved the entire application outside of the building and put it with Salesforce. And then the other thing that they were observing was that even though they had this private cloud infrastructure, they couldn't turn resources off to save money. So even if a business unit went in and turned off 100 virtual machines or 5 or 10 virtual machines, they couldn't give the business unit relief from a cost standpoint, because even though all those machines had been turned off, other than a little bit of power that wasn't being consumed, IT still had all the same resources in their data center. So they're using public cloud in a hybrid strategy because they know that if with the public cloud resources, they can turn them on and off. They can get 100 machines for a month or for several months, and then shut that off when the project is over and immediately realize those savings. But if they have an application that's going to be around for 3 or 5 years, they actually spin that application up in their private cloud environment because they can depreciate it just like they would physical hardware. So this was our little matrix. So if we look at this particular pharmaceutical company, you can see that from a small, medium, and large, they sort of did a small public cloud environment to handle these bursty workloads that they could turn off and turn on really quickly. But they also made a really significant spend on the private cloud because they're modernizing their entire VMware infrastructure, and they outsourced a huge SaaS or huge CRM environment into Salesforce to get agility to that team. So this is another company that sort of did one thing and to buy themselves time, and then did something else as they moved along. So it was a large retail grocery chain. Their vision was very similar to the pharmaceutical company that we described before, in that they wanted sort of a hybrid public-private cloud environment, but they knew it was going to take time over 2012 to actually get their private cloud built up and running, and they wanted to enable the business units back in January to get to agility. So they actually started off with a medium-sized public cloud investment in our environment. And then over the period of the year, they actually built a really large private cloud environment. And when that environment got up and running, got through quality testing and everything, they actually moved their medium and public investment down to a small public investment because they were able to move all the applications they had spun up through the year back into their private environment. But they kept a small public environment up to, again, handle the bursty workloads that they couldn't predict very well. So then the third example that we have is Siemens, their e-meter group. They took more of a stratified approach to this. They wanted to get different levels of resources in the cloud, and they started off with production put in the cloud environment, and they ended up moving testing, and they ended up moving QA and all these other components. So they basically cloudified everything, but they run it in a more of a hybrid approach where they have most of their assets are in the public cloud because the users that use their applications are around the world. So it's a lot of internet-facing stuff, and it is production. But they also have resources in their own VMware environment on site when they just need quick turnaround and churn and just kind of getting some things done internally. And then they move assets back and forth as needed. Whoop, there's some exciting animation there on that slide somehow. So in terms of planning your approach, I know we're running up on time here and we're almost done, and I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So the other key is, so let's say you sort of have an idea now what buckets you fit in, which perspective you're looking at the world from. Are you an infrastructure owner? Are you an application owner? And you're kind of a medium-sized company and you think you're going to do mainly private cloud, but you want some burstable capability, and you think for collaboration you might turn on Dropbox or Box.net and enable business users that way, or maybe Evernote or something, or wherever you landed. As you begin your journey, once you've got your funding, the next step is really figuring out what workloads make sense. So you heard some examples as I went through the different stories, but in everyone, the case is different. So if you're in the sort of I'm transforming everything I do, you know, it might be worth looking at low-risk stuff, low-hanging fruit. So if you've got old Lotus Notes infrastructure that's already virtualized, and you're just trying to free up some capacity on your high-performance SAN that you've invested in for your private cloud, so that mission-critical applications have more resources, it might be worth taking some of the old stuff and actually moving it into the public cloud just to free up resources for all the new growth that you're going to go through in next year. Or it could be the pick-a-project approach. So the workload is a specific business unit. They come in hot and heavy. Maybe they didn't call you to plan, you know, as they should or as you would have hoped, you know, 90 days or 120 days out, but they need it now. You know, and you facilitate their growth out into the public cloud, your private cloud deployed, and maybe you bring them back in-house when you're ready. And so get that thinking there. In terms of the research that you need to do, there are a lot of cloud providers out there. There are a lot of private cloud technologies where you're looking at Citrix or Microsoft, maybe even Eucalyptus, certainly VMware, which is what we use. Figuring out what technology might make the most sense for your organization, for the skill sets that you have, and then some form of evaluation and pilot. So fortunately, most of the public cloud providers offer an easy way for you to test drive their infrastructure. Private clouds are a little harder to test drive. One of the neat things we see people do is if they think they're going to deploy a VMware-based private cloud, they'll actually do a test drive in our environment because it looks exactly the same as what you would get if you deployed it on-premise. So they sort of learn whether or not a VMware-based private cloud would work for them by using a VMware-based public cloud, and it helps them understand then whether that makes sense to go forward. Other cost considerations, so as I mentioned before, you may need help if this is the first time you've done this, getting through that journey, getting through that transformation. So there are professional and advisory services available, whether you need that on the business side to just sort of understand which workloads might be the most optimized or might become the best workloads to move into a cloud-like environment, or if you just need sort of a one-time deal where somebody comes in, drops the equipment off, gets it all set up, wired together, configured, and it helps you sort of get through that first implementation. Training is available today, whether learning the cloud infrastructure technology itself, so if you want training from VMware or any of the other infrastructure providers on how their cloud technology works. And a lot of cloud providers now are offering training in terms of how to use their specific cloud environment. Stopgap resources are important, so taking some sort of percentage of what you think the spend would be and just imagine that you may run out of capacity or you may need more than you need, and being upfront with your CFO in terms of planning and say, you know, this is my best guess. I think we're going to have 500 VMs on this environment, but if it turns out it's 700 or 800, at least you've already gone to the CFO and said, hey, it worked a lot better than we thought. People really liked it, and sort of here's what I think the next spend would be. And some thoughtfulness in terms of your planning helps there too, because what we've seen happen is a lot of people will put in a private cloud infrastructure that's not expandable. So the idea of buying a storage controller that you may only need 2 ports on it to hook up 2 servers, or 4 ports to hook up 4 servers, maybe go ahead and spend the money on the 8-port controller or the 16-port controller, so that you know, you don't have to buy a whole new controller and a whole new setup and basically build it all over again just because you had one more VM than what your existing private cloud would support. And something else we're seeing people use public cloud to dodge that bullet. So let's say you do fill up your private cloud environment sooner than you expected, and it's going to take 30, 60, 90 days to get more capacity set up and running, you can drain the swamp a little bit by moving some of those resources out to the public cloud, buy you time to get that your private cloud expanded, and then bring the resources back. We talked about sprawl a little bit, but these are really just all things to sort of help you save time and money and manage expectations within the business. So we talked about adding a trial amount of money in your budget. So there are free trials, but if you actually try to put a real application out there and really exercise the cloud, it's going to cost money. So the idea of sort of a phased approach and spending maybe in Q1, you put in 25% of the spend. Q2, if you decide you're going to do private cloud, then you deploy the majority of your spend if your trial went well, or you just increase your public cloud spend a little bit more than the trial, but et cetera. And certainly rethinking everything, a drastic amount of planning in that regard.